The mountains of Virginia have a silence that feels alive, an old, breathing stillness that swallows sound and memory alike. Travelers say the fog there doesn't roll, it creeps, curling its way between trees like fingers searching for something lost. Few wander far from the winding roads, and those who do, seldom talk about what they find. When I first saw the cabin, I thought it was abandoned. The roof sagged under the weight of moss and years, and a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney like a ghost reluctant to leave. The woman who stepped out to greet me looked too young to belong to such a place, her hair black, her eyes pale as storm glass. She smiled, but it didn't reach her face. "You're just in time," she said softly. "He's almost home." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and lavender. Another woman sat by the window, brushing her hair, long, dark, and so similar to the first that for a moment I thought I was looking into a reflection. Only when the door creaked open did I realize the truth. There were two of them. A mother and a daughter, and the man they both called husband. The man's eyes darted between them like a trapped thing, his hands trembling as he welcomed me. I remember thinking there was something wrong with the way the daughter's gaze lingered on him, not with love, but with possession. And the mother's smile, thin and trembling, seemed to plead for something she could never say aloud. Outside, the wind began to rise, whispering through the trees as the first drops of rain touched the earth. I didn't know it then, but that night would unravel a story buried deep in the bones of the mountains, a story of blood, silence, and the terrible things families do to keep their secrets from dying. The man had been traveling for days through the blue mist of Virginia's mountains, searching for forgotten faces and abandoned places to capture with his old camera. Photography was not just his craft but his refuge, a way to make sense of the world's decay by freezing it in time. That morning, he followed a narrow trail that snaked through the forest, the path overgrown and slick with moss. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, as though even the birds were wary of being heard there. The trees stood close together, their trunks leaning like eavesdroppers, and the air grew heavy with a strange scent, something sweet and metallic, like rusted flowers. It was then that he saw smoke curling between the trees, faint and gray against the green. At first, he thought it was just an old hunting lodge, one of those cabins long abandoned to the forest. But as he drew closer, he noticed signs of life, a line of laundry swaying in the breeze, the faint sound of a woman humming. The cabin itself was small, built of warped logs and patched shingles, a relic of another century. Yet there was something unsettling about its shape, as if the structure itself had grown rather than been built, the wood twisting unnaturally around the windows and door. When he raised his camera to take a picture, the lens fogged instantly, blurring the image into streaks of gray. He wiped it clean, but the feeling of unease lingered like a warning. As he stepped into the clearing, a silence fell over everything. The humming stopped. The smoke from the chimney thinned. Then the door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and a woman appeared on the threshold. She was young, though her eyes seemed ancient eyes that had seen too much, or perhaps remembered too far. Her expression did not carry fear or surprise, only a kind of wary curiosity. "You're far from town," she said, her voice soft and hollow. He introduced himself, mentioning his work, his fascination with mountain folk and their forgotten stories. The woman smiled faintly, but there was something restrained about it, like a smile borrowed from someone else. "You'll find plenty of stories here," she murmured. "Some better left untold." She invited him inside, and though every instinct told him to refuse, he followed. The air grew colder as he crossed the threshold, and the light shifted, dim, amber, heavy. There was a photograph on the wall beside the hearth, a family portrait. But something about the faces made his stomach tighten. The same woman stood there twice, once as a mother, once as a child, each with the same unblinking eyes, and between them, the same man. Inside the cabin, time seemed to slow, as though the air itself resisted movement. The photographer's eyes adjusted to the dim glow cast by a single oil lamp on the table, flickering against the cracked walls. The woman who had greeted him, Eliza, moved with a calm that felt rehearsed, every gesture deliberate, as if she had long practiced appearing ordinary. Her voice, too, carried that same precision, the kind that conceals more than it reveals. As she poured him tea in a chipped porcelain cup, he noticed another figure in the corner, a younger woman, seated quietly, her face half hidden behind a curtain of dark hair. At first glance, he thought she was Eliza's sister, but then he saw the faint resemblance in their expressions, the shared tilt of the head, the mirrored glance. When Eliza introduced her as Clara, her daughter, the resemblance became uncanny. Clara stood and offered a shy nod. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes had the same colorless depth as her mother's. She spoke softly, her voice echoing the older woman's rhythm like a reflection repeating itself. The photographer, trying to ease his own discomfort, asked if they lived alone. Eliza smiled, though her eyes flicked toward the door before she answered. "Not alone," she said quietly. "My husband will be home soon." Before he could respond, Clara interrupted, her tone strange, possessive. "Our husband," she said, her gaze fixed on her mother. The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment, the photographer wondered if he had misheard. Eliza's hands tightened around the teacup, the sound of porcelain cracking faintly beneath her fingers. He tried to laugh it off, assuming it was a misunderstanding, but neither woman smiled. The silence that followed was suffocating. He could hear the slow ticking of a clock somewhere behind him, steady and unnatural, as though measuring something other than time. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls, and he caught a faint smell drifting in through the open window, a smell like old earth and rain-soaked iron. Eliza finally broke the silence, her voice a whisper. "It's not what you think," she said, but the tremor in her tone betrayed her. Clara's expression softened, almost tenderly, and she reached out to touch her mother's hand. "He loves us both," she said simply, as though reciting a prayer. The photographer's heart thudded in his chest, a primitive pulse of warning. He tried to rise, but his legs felt heavy, anchored by something unseen. Then, from outside, came the crunch of footsteps on wet leaves, slow and deliberate. Both women turned toward the door at once, their faces lit by the same flicker of anticipation, and in that moment, he realized he had stepped into a story that did not want to be found. The night deepened around the cabin, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. The photographer sat at the small wooden table, his unease growing with every minute. The man of the house, Thomas, had returned, a quiet figure with rough hands and eyes that never seemed to settle on anything for long. He greeted the visitor politely, almost too politely, and joined the two women by the fire. The way they arranged themselves unsettled the photographer. Clara sat close to Thomas, resting her hand lightly on his arm, while Eliza, her mother, stared into the flames as though seeing something far beyond the room. The air between the three of them pulsed with something unspoken, something that did not belong in the ordinary rhythm of family life. As he studied their movements, the photographer noticed subtle, eerie details. Above the hearth hung strange objects made of braided hair and twine, woven into circular patterns that resembled both charms and traps. On a shelf lay a row of jars filled with cloudy liquid, each containing what looked like fragments of bone or dried roots. When he asked about them, Eliza's tone shifted slightly. "Old ways," she said. "They keep the mountains calm." Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh, but said nothing. The man's laughter had no warmth, and when he looked at his wife and stepdaughter, there was a tiredness there, a haunted kind of acceptance. Dinner was served in silence, a thin stew that tasted faintly metallic. The photographer forced a smile, complimenting the meal, but his words only seemed to make Clara grin strangely. "He likes it best that way," she said, glancing at her mother. "Raw, like he used to when the old blood was stronger." Her tone carried pride, and the words struck him with a chill he couldn't explain. When he asked what she meant, Thomas's spoon clattered against the bowl, and Eliza quickly changed the subject, asking about his travels. As the fire dimmed, the photographer noticed something else. The room was lined with symbols carved into the wooden beams, loops, crosses, and spirals intertwined in unfamiliar patterns. They were too deliberate to be decorative. When he ran his fingers over one, Eliza's voice cut through the air, sharp and low. "Best not to touch what you don't understand." Her eyes caught the firelight for a moment, reflecting it like glass. Outside, an owl called once and then went silent. The photographer felt the weight of the mountains pressing in from all sides, and for the first time, he sensed that this family's strange devotion, whatever it was, had little to do with love, and everything to do with something ancient that still moved beneath those woods, waiting to be remembered. The wind rose that night, carrying with it the long, mournful sound of something moving through the forest. The photographer had been given a small cot in the corner of the cabin, though sleep refused to come. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper pressed against the window. He tried to convince himself it was nothing more than the mountain's breath, the ordinary noises of an old home, but deep down he knew something else was stirring beyond those walls. Around midnight, the first sound reached him, low and rhythmic, like humming at a distance. It was neither song nor speech, but something older, a chant woven with the cadence of prayer and threat. He rose quietly, his camera in hand, and moved toward the window. The forest outside shimmered faintly in the moonlight, thick with mist. Then, faintly between the trees, he saw them, 3 figures moving in a slow circle, each holding a small oil lamp that swung gently with their steps. The light from the lamps bled into the fog, painting their movements in gold and gray. He couldn't see their faces, only the pale outlines of their arms raised together, and the rhythmic swaying of their bodies in time with the strange chant. His heart began to pound as he realized the melody matched the strange symbols carved into the beams inside the house, each line and curve seeming to echo the rhythm of what he now heard outside. When he turned from the window, Clara was standing in the doorway behind him. Her face was calm, but her eyes glowed faintly in the lamplight, reflecting something wild and knowing. "They're calling the mountain," she whispered, as if answering a question he hadn't yet asked. Her voice was steady, too steady. "It listens when we remember." Before he could speak, she stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. "You shouldn't watch. Outsiders aren't meant to see the waking." He wanted to ask who was out there, what they were doing, but his mouth had gone dry. A deep vibration passed through the floor, subtle but real, as if something massive had shifted beneath the earth. Clara tilted her head, listening to it, then smiled faintly. "It knows you're here," she said, her tone almost tender. Outside, the chanting grew louder, turning into a murmur of many voices, rising and falling like waves. The photographer backed away from the window, clutching his camera, his breath shallow. For the first time, he felt certain the family wasn't simply isolated by choice. They were bound to the land, to the echoes in the soil, and to something ancient that demanded their worship beneath the whispering trees. The photographer awoke to pale morning light spilling through the cracks in the wooden shutters, though the air in the cabin still felt heavy, as if the night's strange ritual hadn't ended but merely gone silent. Eliza was nowhere to be seen, and the only sound was the soft scraping of metal against wood. He turned to find Clara sitting at the table, cutting apples with a small blade, her movements slow and deliberate. When she noticed him watching, she smiled faintly, the expression too calm for someone who had spent the night among chants and shadows. "You slept," she said softly. "That's good. Most people don't, not the first night." The photographer forced a nervous laugh, trying to hide his discomfort, but her tone carried no trace of humor. She pushed a slice of apple toward him and said, "Mama's gone to fetch water. She always does it at dawn. It's her way of keeping the ground quiet." He didn't ask what that meant, though curiosity gnawed at him. Instead, he studied the girl's face, the peculiar calm in her eyes, and the way she spoke about her mother as though their bond was more than blood, as if they shared a secret inheritance. He asked cautiously if the chants he heard were part of an old custom, something passed down from their ancestors. Clara looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's older than that. Mama says the mountains remember who we are, and that we must remember too. She says the blood must stay pure, or the land will forget us." The photographer frowned, unsure if she meant it literally. But then she continued, her tone almost childlike. "Thomas belongs to us both. Mama said that's how the blood stays strong. It's not wrong if it's meant." She said it with such certainty that his stomach turned. There was no shame in her words, no hint of confusion, only belief. "She told me when I turned 13, Clara went on. Said the mountain chose me next, same as it chose her. It's our way." The photographer's throat tightened. He tried to reason with her, to tell her that such things were not the mountain's will but a prison built from isolation and madness. Yet her expression didn't change, she only tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study an unfamiliar animal. "You wouldn't understand," she said, and her voice softened, almost pitying. "Outsiders never do. You think love should belong to just one person, but love here belongs to blood. That's how it keeps us alive. The words echoed through him like a chill. Somewhere outside, he thought he heard Eliza's voice calling Clara's name, faint and distant, carried by the wind like a hymn. Later that afternoon, when the light began to fade into that dim gold that belongs only to the mountains, the photographer found himself alone in the cabin. Eliza and Clara had gone to gather herbs, leaving him with the uneasy quiet that clung to the house like dust. He moved through the small rooms, camera in hand, trying to distract himself by studying the textures of the old wood, the way the years had darkened its grain. But as he wandered, his curiosity pulled him toward a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. Each step creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing faintly through the stillness. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and a faint smell of mildew and smoke filled his lungs. The attic was dim, lit only by a thin slit of daylight through a broken window. Cobwebs hung like veils, and trunks lined the walls, their lids warped from years of damp. One trunk in the corner drew his attention. It was newer than the others, its brass latch polished as if handled often. He hesitated before lifting the lid, his pulse loud in his ears. Inside lay a stack of old books and papers, their pages yellowed and brittle. Among them was a thick, leather-bound Bible, its cover worn but carefully preserved. When he opened it, his breath caught. The inside pages weren't like any he had seen before. The margins were filled with handwriting, dense and looping, with names written and rewritten across generations. Each page bore the same 3 names repeated in different orders: Eliza, Clara, Thomas. Sometimes the script changed, sometimes the dates vanished altogether, replaced by symbols or scratched-out lines. There were no surnames, no mention of births or deaths, only the relentless repetition of those 3 names, as if the family tree had been folded in on itself again and again until it became a circle. In the back of the book, pressed between 2 pages, was a faded photograph, one that made his skin prickle. It showed a man and 2 women standing in front of the same cabin, their faces blurred by age, yet unmistakably the same as the people he had met. Only the photograph was dated more than 70 years ago. A shadow shifted in the doorway, and he turned sharply, heart pounding. Eliza stood there, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't touch that," she said, her voice calm but hollow. He tried to speak, to ask how such a thing could be possible, but her gaze silenced him. She stepped closer and gently took the Bible from his hands. "Some families are chosen to remember," she said softly. "Ours just remembers longer than most." Then she closed the book and smiled, a slow, sorrowful smile that carried the weight of centuries. The realization settled over him like a slow poison. As the hours passed, the photographer could no longer deny what he had seen in that old Bible. The repetition of the same 3 names, Eliza, Clara, Thomas, throughout generations could not be coincidence or clerical error. It was deliberate, intentional, as though time itself had been folded around these people to preserve their bloodline. He sat by the fire that evening, the weight of the truth pressing down on him while Eliza quietly stirred a pot over the flames. Clara sat near Thomas, their heads bowed together in a posture that might have seemed tender if not for the emptiness in their eyes. There was no spark of affection, only duty, a mechanical bond rooted in something older and darker than love. He tried to convince himself that the explanation was simple, that isolation had bred delusion. Yet every detail in the cabin, the symbols carved into the beams, the strange woven talismans, the careful silence between the 3, hinted at something far beyond madness. It was ritual. He began to understand that this family had lived here for generations, hidden in the folds of the mountains, cut off from the outside world by both choice and belief. Their survival, their identity, seemed bound to one rule: that the blood must remain undiluted, preserved like a relic. The idea made him sick, but when he glanced at Eliza, he saw no trace of guilt. Instead, there was pride, a quiet, solemn pride in having obeyed a command older than morality itself. As dusk deepened, he ventured outside to clear his thoughts. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. The forest around the cabin seemed alive, whispering as it shifted in the wind. The mountains rose like walls on every side, sealing this strange family inside their own history. He imagined how, over the decades, their ancestors must have disappeared one by one into these woods, leaving only the next generation to repeat the same twisted pattern. The isolation that had once protected them had become a cage, and within it, they had learned to worship their own lineage as if it were divine. When he returned inside, he caught sight of Clara watching him from the shadows, her expression unreadable. "You've seen it now," she said softly, almost accusingly. "You know why we can't leave." He wanted to tell her that they could still be free, that blood did not bind fate, but when he looked at her face, so like her mother's, so eerily familiar, he saw generations staring back. The mountains, he realized, had not just hidden their secret, they had preserved it, embalmed it, and fed it until it became part of the land itself. The storm began without warning, rolling down from the ridges like a living force. Rain lashed the cabin roof, and thunder cracked so close it shook the floorboards. The photographer sat by the window, staring into the darkness where the trees bent and writhed under the wind. Inside, the family had grown quiet. Thomas sat rigid in his chair, his face pale and slick with sweat, while Eliza moved about the room in silence, lighting candles one by one as though preparing for some unseen ritual. Clara stood by the hearth, her hair loose, her expression distant. The tension between them had grown unbearable since the photographer's discovery of the Bible. It hung in the air like the heavy scent of burning wood. Every glance carried meaning, every breath trembled with something unspoken. When the clock struck midnight, the storm reached its height. The photographer thought he heard voices outside, low, rhythmic murmurs, like the chanting he'd heard before, but this time they sounded closer, circling the cabin. Thomas rose suddenly, knocking over his chair, and shouted for the voices to stop. Eliza's face turned toward him, not with surprise, but with a sorrow that seemed almost rehearsed. "It's time," she whispered. Thomas shook his head, his voice breaking. "No more. I can't." Clara moved toward him, her eyes bright with tears. "You promised," she said softly, "you said you'd keep the line alive." The words struck the photographer like a physical blow. He realized he was witnessing the collapse of a pact that had held this family together for generations. Thomas's refusal was not rebellion, it was desperation. He stumbled toward the door, but Eliza blocked his way. "You can't run from blood," she said, her tone calm but trembling at the edges. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the room in white, and for a heartbeat the photographer saw something terrifying in Eliza's face, a mixture of grief and devotion so absolute it seemed inhuman. Thomas turned to Clara, pleading for her to leave with him, but her expression hardened. "If you go," she said, her voice breaking, "the mountain will take you instead." Then everything happened at once. The storm roared, the candles guttered, and the photographer heard a single scream, raw and short, cut off almost instantly. When he turned, Thomas was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, and Clara stood above him, the knife trembling in her hand. Her face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady as she whispered, "He's free now." The room fell silent except for the storm outside, and in that silence, the photographer understood that freedom, in this place, was never meant for the living. The photographer ran. He didn't think, he simply reacted, his body driven by pure terror. The cabin's door burst open beneath his hands, and he stumbled out into the storm. The rain was cold and sharp, soaking him within seconds, but he didn't stop to feel it. Behind him, the light of the cabin flickered through the trees like a dying heartbeat. The forest was alive with noise, the rush of water, the groan of branches, the wind screaming through the hollows. Yet beneath it all, he thought he could still hear voices, 2 of them, calling his name. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the woods in impossible directions. He turned once, only to see 2 figures in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain. One stood still at the edge of the clearing, the other moved closer with a slow, deliberate grace. "Don't go," a voice called, soft but clear. It was Eliza's voice, or was it Clara's? The tone wavered between the two, shifting with the wind, each syllable overlapping the next. He backed away, tripping over roots and fallen branches, his breath coming in harsh bursts. The rain blurred his vision, but he could still make out their pale faces glowing faintly in the stormlight. "You don't belong to this place," he shouted, though his words were snatched away by the wind. The forest swallowed the sound whole. Then came laughter, not loud, but close, carried from somewhere to his left. He spun around, and there she was. Eliza, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes dark and gleaming. She was no longer the fragile, sorrowful woman he had met, but something else entirely, something that seemed to flicker between forms. Her features shifted, blurring and sharpening with each flash of lightning, and for an instant, her face became Clara's. "You've seen it now," she whispered, her voice layering over itself, two tones speaking as one. "You've seen the blood." He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a rock, and fell hard into the mud. When he tried to rise, she was gone. Only the wind moved through the trees, whispering his name again and again in that same overlapping voice. Panic clawed at his chest as he turned in circles, unsure which direction led to the road. Every path looked the same, dark, narrow, endless. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he saw the faint light of a lantern, but as he drew closer, it vanished, replaced by the echo of soft footsteps behind him. He ran again, heart pounding, the sound of his name chasing him through the storm. And with every flash of lightning, he caught glimpses of faces between the trees, sometimes Eliza's, sometimes Clara's, each calling to him from opposite sides of the woods, their voices now perfectly in sync, as if the mountain itself had learned to speak with both their tongues. When the storm finally broke, the mountains fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The photographer wandered for hours through the drenched forest, disoriented and trembling, the world around him blurred by exhaustion and fear. His camera was gone, lost somewhere in the dark, and his thoughts drifted in and out of reason. He could no longer tell how far he had come from the cabin or whether he was moving in circles. The trees looked identical, their wet trunks glistening under the weak dawn light, their branches drooping like skeletal arms. When he finally stumbled upon a clearing, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The earth smelled of ash and rain. He lifted his head, and his breath caught. The clearing was empty, but it was too clean, too precise. The ground where the cabin had stood was bare, flattened, as if nothing had ever been built there. No wood, no stone, no debris. Only a single mound of freshly turned soil lay in the center, marked by a lone gravestone leaning slightly to one side. He crawled toward it, his hands sinking into the wet earth. The inscription was worn but legible enough to read three names carved in uneven letters: Eliza, Clara, Thomas. There were no dates, no epitaphs, only those three names repeating the pattern he had seen in the Bible, now etched permanently into the mountain's memory. The forest around him was utterly still. No birds called, no wind stirred. He whispered their names aloud, hoping for an echo, but the sound seemed to die before leaving his lips. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed every trace of the family, leaving only that stone as proof they had ever existed. A sudden chill passed through him, a feeling not of cold but of presence. He looked up and saw movement at the edge of the trees, a figure standing just beyond the clearing, half hidden in the mist. It was a woman, her outline faint, her hair dark and wet. She did not move closer, only watched. Then another figure appeared beside her, smaller, her shape mirroring the first. They stood together in silence until the fog thickened and their forms dissolved into it. The photographer rose unsteadily, backing away from the grave. He could hear the faintest whisper carried on the wind, two voices intertwined, calling his name once more. He turned to run, but the forest seemed endless now, stretching in all directions without path or sky. Days later, when rescuers found him wandering along the mountain road, his eyes were hollow and his hands still stained with soil. They found no cabin, no grave, no trace of any family, only a roll of film inside his coat pocket, each frame blank except for a faint, ghostly blur where faces should have been.